Good afternoon and welcome to NRCS's Conservation Outcomes webinar series. My name is Liz Marshall and I serve as the Outcomes Team Leader for NRCS's Outcomes Team. The Outcomes Team conducts this webinar series to highlight NRCS's conservation outcomes assessment efforts and to demonstrate innovative conservation tools and data that can assist with conservation planning and with impact assessment. Many of the projects described in these webinars are administered through the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, or CEAP. CEAP has as its mission to quantify the environmental effects of conservation practices and conservation programs and to develop the science base necessary to effectively manage the agricultural landscape for environmental quality. These webinars generally take place on the fourth Thursday of each month at 3 p.m. We'll get started with the presentation in just a minute, but first I want to go over a few logistics. The webinar is being recorded. All participants that are joining today's webinar are in listen-only mode, and all audio is being broadcast through your device's speakers. If you're having audio challenges, sometimes computer or mobile device headsets can help with your audio quality and your volume. Also, please note the closed captioning link that's provided in the box on your screen entitled Today's Links. The captions open in a new browser window where you can follow along with the presenter's comments. Although you don't have audio today, we still want you to be able to participate in the webinar. So please type any questions or comments into the Q&A box that you will shortly see on your screen. It will replace the chat box that you see now. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation. However, questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Please also note the connection status bar indicator to the right of the Help button in the Adobe Connect menu bar. If your bars all show as green, that generally means your network connection is strong and you should have no problem joining in today's webinar. However, if you have a weak connection or if you experience interruptions in bandwidth that prevent you from participating, the webinar recording will be accessible through the Conservation Outcomes Webinar Series webpage. The link to that site is in the box on your screen labeled Today's Links. A PDF of today's slides is also available to download from the box on your screen entitled Today's Handouts. And finally, if you're willing to forego the links, downloads, and the Q&A boxes in order to make the presentation larger, you can use the icon with the 4 corner arrows that appears in the upper right of the presentation box to make the slides appear in full screen. I'm now pleased to turn the microphone over to Matt Lohr, Chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, to introduce today's webinar. After Chief Lohr's introductory remarks, we will turn the reins over to Lori Metz. Lori is NRCS's Grazing Lands Component Leader for the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, and she will be moderating today's webinar. Thank you, and now over to you, Chief Lohr.
Hey, thank you so much, Liz, and good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate the chance to kick off this month's Outcome Teams webinar. I have really enjoyed being able to be a part of these over the last couple of months. Just a wonderful opportunity to highlight and showcase the great work that we're doing as an agency and really be able to, as you said, Liz, to be able to really quantify the effects of the great work of our agency and the work that our conservation efforts are taking place. So really thank you for the chance to kick this one off. A really exciting topic that I know everyone on the webinar today is going to enjoy. There's over 400 million acres across the country of non-federally managed forest lands, and lots and lots of benefits from these lands, from wood products to habitat to soil protection, streams and aquifers. I mean, just lots of important benefits, but these forests are really under a lot of threat from population expansion and climate change and invasive species and catastrophic wildfires. And in my travels as chief over the last 2 years, I've had a chance to see a lot of these areas firsthand, and especially from these wildfires, it's absolutely devastating the effects that it has on our forests. So in 2017, our seed grazing lands teams actually teamed up with the folks at Colorado NRCS and the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University to leverage our existing forest research and explore some resource outcomes using innovative restoration design approaches with forest conservation practices versus a traditional fuel hazard reduction design. And so the study also worked to capture the need to be strategic about these conservation investments and treating over a whole entire watershed instead of just a small random parcel at a time. So the presentation today is going to share the results from that study and really show ways that NRCS is using our innovation, our multifaceted forest science to really optimize gains in these forest resource health, longevity, and function. So really excited to be able to highlight this work. Thank you for everyone joining in today, and thanks for the work that went in to make this presentation happen. So this time I'm going to turn it over to Lori Metz, our Seed Grazing Lands Component Leader. And again, thanks everyone for letting me kick this off today, and thanks for everyone being a part.
All right. Thank you so much, Chief Laura. I appreciate the intro. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, this is Lori Metz. I'm the National Seed Grazing Land Component Leader. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jeff Cannon. He's a forest landscape ecologist with the Jones Center in Georgia. Prior to Dr. Cannon's move to the Jones Center in 2019, he worked at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, part of Colorado State University, and he was a lead scientist on this seed grazing land project that we'll share with you today called From Counting Acres to Making Acres Count, Quantifying Restoration Outcomes in Frequent Fire Forests. So before Jeff gets started, you may be wondering why the NRCS Seed Grazing Lands component is investing efforts to understand forest conservation practices and outcomes. Our vision is to assess land condition or health and economic values of NRCS conservation investments on grazing lands. Grazing occurs most notably on rangeland, pastureland, and forestland, so those are our focal areas. Groundbreaking literature syntheses and a dynamic bibliography published by Seed Grazing Lands in the early 2000s revealed that determining the outcomes of practices on grazing lands is quite complicated, and there are considerable valuable outcomes that are also achieved alongside production goals from livestock. Those outcomes yield necessary ecosystem services, including clean air and water, wildlife habitat, fire and fuel hazard reduction, and so on. The Seed Grazing Lands portfolio has 4 interrelated facets. We use environmental modeling to quantify practice effects, ecosystem service valuation to link practice outcomes to ecosystem services. We use remote sensing data to expand analysis areas and derive input data. And we use effective targeting of conservation needs to achieve optimal outcomes. All of these link together, much like puzzle pieces, to create a picture of conservation achievements across the landscape. Jeff's project to quantify outcomes of forest treatment practices under 2 different designs offers sound science and feedback to NRCS and landowners on benefits beyond timber production goals. His study used all 4 facets to create a picture of healthier forests. The problem in this study area is that there are overly dense stands of ponderosa pine and understory vegetation due to prolonged fire suppression in the 20th century. The threat is seen through an accumulation of fuel, including dead wood, litter, and live vegetation. That fuel feeds the fire. Dry western forests used to burn with regular frequency, but the fire suppression efforts have changed that frequency and the intensity, leaving large landscapes at high risk of carrying fires farther and hotter than they ever have before. Soil erosion, sedimentation, loss of habitat, loss of forage, and the risk of invasive species colonizing areas after a burn are real threats. Our study area is in one of the biggest drinking water catchments in Colorado, serving over 1.5 million people. Nearly 25% of the state's population are dependent upon water collected, treated, and distributed by Denver Water. Being in the water business brings many challenges, particularly when catastrophic wildfires happen, followed by heavy rainfall on exposed soils. After the 2002 Hayman fire, which burned about 137,000 acres, 40 years worth of sediment in one rainfall event was delivered to one of the reservoirs in the Denver water system. This caused a 2-month interruption in water service and high costs to maintain storage capacity and water cleanliness. To remedy the situation, Denver Water partnered with NRCS, the Forest Service, and others to reduce wildfire risk, keep soils in place, restore forest functions and habitats. Everyone recognized the need to change forest treatment approaches and forest management. Working together gets results. This study sought to capture effects of NRCS conservation practice designs in western dry forest systems that are prone to high wildfire risk. There are many resources or ecosystem services that western forests provide, with water being one of the most important. Colorado NRCS, under the leadership of State Conservationist Clint Evans and State Conservation Forester Jonas Feinstein, is now designing forest practices with restoration objectives in mind to reduce the threats and to regain forests with proper ecological functions. So is it working? Are we doing the right things in the right places? We'll see how Jeff's project offers NRCS options to improve selection of treatment areas, design more innovative treatments, and achieve more conservation outcomes. And toward the end, Jeff is going to lead us through a brief description of a new project that we're starting in the southeastern U.S. on longleaf pine restoration for water conservation and availability improvements. Jeff, I will now turn it over to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Lori. And I'm following the chat here, and so I just want to make sure folks can hear okay. But I'm Jeff Cannon. I'm a forest landscape ecologist at the Jones Center at Ichauway, and as Lori mentioned, prior to that was a research scientist at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University. And so I'll be talking today about some work that we've been doing looking at ponderosa pine forests in order to sort of get a better understanding of the landscape scale impact that restoration treatments can have, and try to walk through some ways that we can quantify that and try to better prioritize and evaluate some of the benefits that are occurring from different types of conservation practices. So first, I just want to mention I'll be talking about work that's occurred over multiple years and involved several institutions, especially at the Colorado State University, NRCS, both at the local state level in Colorado and national level. Lots of collaborators from the Forest Service contributed to some of the data and work here. I'll be talking about some newer work with collaborators at the Jones Center at Ichauway, and then there are also other partners and nonprofits and universities that were involved as well. So first I'll kind of just talk a little bit about ponderosa pine forests, and this is what sort of a typical ponderosa pine forest looked like historically. This photo was taken in 1899 near the Cheeseman Reservoir, which is outside of Denver, Colorado, and it's part of the watershed that currently provides Denver with a very large portion of its water. And you can see from this photograph that some of the characteristics that sort of define ponderosa pine forests. They're really open. There'd be quite a diverse understory. And also notice there's lots and lots of variability. So you see these kind of changes in density that sort of follow topographic patterns. You can see large openings in some areas. You can see groups of trees and some single isolated trees. So not only were densities relatively low and open, but they also had this complex spatial pattern. This is that same area with a photo taken closer to 2000, and you can see that it looks quite a bit different. Obviously, the density has increased a whole lot. That's going to change a lot of the microclimate. So you're going to have big changes in reductions in herbaceous cover. In a lot of these systems, you get an increase in Douglas fir, which is a species that will fill in underneath the canopy and create this continuous, kind of make continuous fuel from the surface to the canopy, so that when fires do occur, they can become, really devastating crown fires. And And these changes are due to a lot of changes in land use practices, so some overgrazing and regrowth after harvesting, and of course fire suppression. So this problem is occurring in a lot of western dry forests in general, and that can lead to not only high severity wildfire, but high severity wildfire that occurs over really large areas in spatial scale. And so here's a photo where you can see, almost 100% mortality of the overstory over a large area. And ponderosa pine has a relatively short dispersal distance. So whenever you get these large, burned areas, it takes a really long time for ponderosa to recolonize. And so some of these areas are anticipated to not recover as forest, but instead transition to shrubland ecosystems. And then another issue that you can see is without the protection of canopy cover to intercept rain, you've got this open, this kind of open situation where any precipitation that occurs, especially in these granitic erosive soils that occur outside of Denver, you can get these really huge issues with erosion and sedimentation. So we wanted to look at sort of how restoration can deal with some of these issues. And so because of these problems that I've talked about, a lot of restoration treatments in ponderosa pine, a lot of them, there's lots of diverse treatments going on, but in general, many of them focus on reducing tree density and field continuity first and foremost, with the objective of reducing large high severity crown fires, and I mentioned post-fire erosion. And then what I'll talk about a little bit more, emphasize in this talk as well, is some of those aspects of restoring the variable forest structure and diversity and wildlife habitat quality. So here's a photo of an area that had a restoration treatment that was done in Colorado by the state conservation forester Jonas Feinstein, or he was involved with it, and some local stakeholders. And so you can see there's some of those characteristics of the historic forest are exhibited here. You can see large openings, single trees, groups of trees. And this spatial structure is thought to be really important for a few reasons. So if you look at the openings here, you can see a pretty lush understory with high herbaceous diversity. And a lot of evidence shows that the larger gaps are, when they're large enough to really have substantial change in the microenvironment, you can get some pretty large increases in species richness as you kind of go inward to the core of these openings. So in a lot of cases, these large openings are absent from current forests, but they also house a lot of our herbaceous diversity. Secondly, the tree groups, and notice not only do we have these really open areas, we also have a few small pockets of dense shade. And so that spatial pattern is important and has some connections to wildlife. For example, the northern goshawk is one species that benefits from this kind of spatial structure because some of its prey species specialize in denser patches of forest. Other prey species specialize in openings, and so having those couple of elements interspersed with each other can increase habitat quality for northern goshawks. And then here's this is a different treatment area, but kind of zoomed out in the landscape, and you can see it's kind of surrounded by this really dense forest, but within the treatment area, you've got large openings, individual trees, and some of that historic structure restored. And this differs a lot from what's often sort of thought of in silvicultural treatments, where if you're thinking about wood production, the kind of main thing you want to do is just like in gardening, put your plants evenly spaced in rows to maximize production. And in a lot of cases, this spatial pattern can have some inadvertent effects on some of the other ecological objectives that we care about. So you could have the exact same density in an evenly spaced forest versus one with a lot more spatial structure to it. But the understory is going to look a lot different. When you've got evenly spaced trees, you're going to have relatively even shade, homogeneous conditions, and basically every acre is really similar to the rest. And so there's a lot missing in terms of some of those micro or those finer scale elements that are important for herb diversity and wildlife. So I'll be talking about a couple of projects here and what we can learn about restoration effectiveness. So first of all, what can we learn from others? I'll be talking about a U.S. Forest Service program and some monitoring that was done there. From adaptive management, looking over projects over time where there's been sort of formal process of feedback, how can that improve restoration outcomes? And then lastly, I'll kind of focus on the bulk of the talk on our SEEP project, which use simulation modeling to help break this kind of complex question down to better understand where we can have the largest impact on increasing ecological benefits. So first, for the Forest Service project, you may be familiar with the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, or CFLRP. This is a national program where national forests cooperate with local stakeholders to plan, implement, and monitor individual restoration treatments. And so we looked at a large area that had been, received about 15 of these treatments over a span of 6 or 7 years. This is part of a 10-year program. And, the Forest Service was monitoring things like changing in density and composition, but some of these spatial elements weren't being addressed. And so one of the things we did at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute was to work with the Forest Service to develop some remote sensing tools that we could use to analyze changes in forest patterns to complement some of the on-the-ground data they were collecting on stand, structure and composition. And so we used some satellite imagery in a process called supervised classification that allowed us to take imagery before and after restoration treatment, look at where canopy versus openings were present, and then analyze those in a couple of different ways. So in this kind of bottom left colorful figure, you can see the green canopy, and then these warm colored areas are representing areas that are larger openings or meadows and we've identified the interior portions of those where we're expected to have a much higher herbaceous diversity. So increasing those meadows was one of the goals. Also on the right here, you can see these different colors all represent different patches of canopy of different sizes. So the dark purple are single or individual trees or small patches, and the darker green are larger, more continuous patches of trees. So we're also able to look at the complexity of the forest patches to see whether we're not only increasing gap cover but also increasing some of these spatial elements as well. And then paired with that, we also had some historical data, and so from across the Front Range to use for guidelines. These weren't developed until several years into the restoration project, but we were able to kind of take a look back and compare some of the outcomes of the restoration to some of the historic data. And what we found was, in general, these restoration treatments compared to the pre-treatment condition decreased Douglas fir basal area, which is one of the goals, to an extent that likely reduces fire intensity. But as you can see, compared to historical conditions, the density of Douglas fir was still quite high. And looking at gap cover, that was also increased to an extent but whenever we looked at gap frequency and overall, it tended to be lower than what we saw historical. So in both of these instances, we saw movement in the right direction on these two variables, and of course we looked at more, but still quite a bit shy of some of the historic conditions. Like I mentioned, the CFLRP also had an adaptive management program, so that allowed us to look at restoration treatments over time. And as part of the CFLRP, stakeholders and researchers and implementers met together, sometimes in the field, sometimes in a conference room, and went over some results of treatments and discussed them early in the process, and then tried to incorporate those shortcomings and changes in future treatments. And so it was identified pretty early that some of the restoration treatments maybe weren't aggressive enough in sort of getting close to the historical conditions. And then you can see that feedback was, over time what we saw was larger basal area reductions that are going to approach some of the historical conditions that were more or less in line with our desired conditions. But when we looked at other metrics like the relative importance of ponderosa pine over Douglas fir, that was relatively unchanged. And when we looked at horizontal complexity, that was something that actually decreased over time. So even though some of these outcomes really are improving over time, other ones tend to be a little bit more challenging. So with these larger reductions in density, it takes a really careful eye to try to plan them in such a way that you can also do that while maintaining a variable forest structure. So in general, what we found was the density reductions are typically aggressive enough to reduce fire hazard, but some of these goals to restore forest complexity can be a lot more difficult. And so what we wanted to do was use some simulation studies to better understand where the opportunities for restoration were. And so I've been kind of talking about the goals of restoration in the Colorado Front Range and elsewhere in ponderosa pine to decrease tree density and fuel continuity and restore forest structure. But also there's kind of these larger landscape goals that sort of depend not just on the stand that you're in, but also the surrounding landscape. What's the general burn probability for a specific area, or if you're worried about erosion, it depends a lot on the landscape, the slope, how close you are to streams for that erosion, where sedimentation might occur. So there are also these landscape scale goals that we wanted to look at and wanted to use a landscape scale approach. So in the SEEP projects, like I said, our goals were to sort of evaluate, if you looked at a really large landscape, you have all these different areas where you may want to implement restoration treatments or maybe have implemented restoration treatments. And we wanted to try to develop a way to quantify for an individual restoration effort, how can we quantify what the contribution to some landscape goal was. And this is the Upper South Platte watershed. Like I said, this feeds Denver, is a big source of water for Denver. There's been the Hayman wildfire that occurred here that Lori mentioned. And ponderosa pine is primarily in these upper and lower montane areas that are green and red on the map on the left. And so what we want to do is to develop a simulation model where we could simulate different types of restoration treatments and then evaluate their impact on a kind of an array of ecological variables. And so I won't talk too much about the specific coupled modeling, but whenever you're doing a project like this, of course, we can't realistically implement restoration over entire large watershed, so we wanted to take the simulation approach. And essentially what we started with were some national data on forest structure, and where we kind of understood what the canopy cover and canopy height was and a little bit about the understory fuels. And what we wanted to do was simulate different types of conservation practices by turning those dials on canopy cover or canopy height or fuels to sort of represent what may be done if a forester were to come in and do restoration. And so we compared two types of restoration, sort of a typical business as usual fuel hazard reduction where we reduce fuels relatively homogenously, or a restoration simulation where we took some historic data and look and try to maintain, get to the low density from the historical conditions, but also maintain that spatial variability that characterize stands. And then once we had these simulated landscapes, we could run those through an array of models, fire models like SLAM map, soil erosion models like Russell, and measure some landscape heterogeneity metrics. And we just used 3 here, but you could really implement additional models for this kind of framework. We're working with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies right now to additionally add on some information on bird richness, avian community richness as well. So right now we're kind of looking at fire and erosion and structural heterogeneity, but a number of different ecological variables can be incorporated. And to sort of give you a view of what it looks like to turn the dials and simulate these 2 treatments, this area on the left is a typical catchment in the Upper South Platte watershed. This is a kind of the smallest sub-watershed that we can define based on the hydrological data. These are about, I think, around 500 acres on average. And what you can see is the white to green gradient. The dark green represents high density patches, and the white areas represent very low canopy cover, and the beige is in between. And so this is the initial condition. And for the fuel hazard reduction, we implemented essentially a 30% reduction in canopy cover across the entire catchment. And so what you can see is that more or less had a homogenizing effect where you're seeing a lot more of the 30 to 40% range for canopy cover here. In the bottom graphic, which looks fairly similar until you look closely, what we did was we used historical data to define what historically this area may have been in terms of the canopy cover density as well as its variability, and then tried to mimic that on the landscape. And so the average canopy cover ended up being relatively similar, but what you can see here is this lighter area here, which potentially represents a drier slope. There was more aggressive cutting. And then here on this southern edge was probably a north-facing slope that was a little bit wetter, and that's where some of the higher canopy retention was. So in general, kind of the idea here at the upper portion was to look at a homogeneous fuel treatment, and at the bottom was to not only reduce fuels but also try to maintain some of those aspects of the historic structure. And so when you zoom out, you can really see how what effects these had depending on the catchment. So here you can see on the left is a relatively homogeneous looking fuel hazard reduction treatment and a more complex restoration treatment on the right. And so once we have this, we can estimate things like, what's the typical change in canopy cover or variability? Where have we created the most meadows, or where have we created more landscape diversity or complexity, which, like I mentioned, is going to be correlated to a lot of those wildlife metrics. And so I'll just kind of show you one result here. This is showing catchment by catchment where each of these restoration treatments, what effect that they would have on landscape complexity. So on the left, the fuel hazard reduction treatment, you've got these kind of light to magenta colors, which means either the paler colors mean really not a large effect, and the more magenta colors means that landscape complexity was actually decreased, which may not be surprising seeing those kind of homogeneous looking treatments before. But then on the right, when you look at the restoration treatment, you can see there's this increase over either a little change or an increase in landscape complexity, which again also should be no surprise since that's more or less what these treatments were designed to do. Now, once we have these treated landscapes, we can also assess other potential benefits like changes in fire behavior. So we use FlamMap to simulate if a fire occurred in any pixel on this landscape, would we expect it to burn as a surface fire, a fire that occasionally torches and kills small patches of trees, or might we expect an active running crown fire? And so we had some questions about, what's the potential for large, high-severity patches of fire? If things burn under moderate conditions, what are our opportunities for prescribed fire? And so we could estimate a few different variables like that. This integrated fire hazard, this is a metric that combines the probability of a fire with the expected fire intensity. And so in general, what we see here is that both the fuel hazard reduction and the restoration treatment performed relatively similarly overall, but their sort of spatial pattern differed a bit. And again, here the lighter colors represent where the treatment had relatively little effect, and then the darker green colors represent where fire hazard decreased the most. And then lastly, we can look at some of the metrics related to erosion. So we combined to look at post-fire erosion. So like I mentioned earlier, following a fire, there's especially high-severity canopy fires high-severity crown fires can leave forests pretty vulnerable to erosion. And so what we wanted to do was sort of identify those areas where we might expect high-severity fire and simulate what erosion effects and sedimentation may occur. So we used Russell, which is the revised universal soil loss equation, and estimated what the potential reduction in erosion and sedimentation may be from these two different approaches. And again, so these blue areas are representing areas where sedimentation and erosion decreased. And then zooming, kind of looking back at the entire watershed, evaluating that at the catchment scale, what we see are these pale areas is where there was little impact, and the sort of magenta and purple areas where we saw a much greater reduction in post-fire sedimentation. So, and again, both of these outcomes were relatively similar on average, but their location seemed to differ quite a bit. So, you know, in terms of how to use this kind of information, you know, if you care about one specific variable, or a landowner cares a lot about one specific variable, you can, you know, zoom in on things like fire hazard or erosion risk, or you know, landscape complexity. But in terms of the agency, one thing that we wanted to do was also see, well, how can we use these different sets of information to develop some prioritizations or some sort of multi-benefit evaluations. And this is sort of I put this prioritization in quotes in terms, or rank things from most beneficial to least beneficial. So if for example, NRCS wanted to evaluate changes in multiple variables, you can look at those individual impacts and assign them different weights to decide, you know, which areas meet criteria for different treatments, or meet criteria for different stakeholders. So in this case, we just provided equal weighting. If you cared equally about reducing fire hazard and increasing landscape complexity and decreasing sedimentation, where may you treat? And so these darker blue areas are basically showing areas where lots of those goals are overlapping very strongly. So these are areas where investment in restoration is going to have the biggest impact for those three different metrics. And so NRCS, I could see, could use this type of data in a lot of different ways. So one could be sort of you know, backwards looking. So looking at where conservation practices have been implemented, and seeing, you know, if you look at the different parcels that have been where you're working with producers, are those falling in the areas that are best going to achieve these various outcomes? So you could use it like an evaluation of past treatments. You could also use it to look forward and look into prioritization. So if you're looking into a new region that has seen little input from NRCS, you could use it to kind of understand those areas where individual restoration treatments or investment in conservation practices is going to have the biggest effect. Maybe areas that are candidates for purchasing easements, for example. And then also use it in the present with you know, talking with individual stakeholders, and then showing them, or individual producers, and showing them what you know, what the particular benefits on their land can be and what goals can best be met. And then here I'm kind of comparing the two different types of restoration treatments: the fuel hazard reduction and the more complex historical restoration. And you can see those benefits and their priorities change depending on the conservation practice used. And so one of the benefits of this, like I mentioned, is I talked about three variables here related to fire, erosion, and landscape complexity. But this kind of model, to the extent that you can connect them to elements of forest structure and turn the dials in a way that can represent treatments, this could be expanded to a lot of different, lots of different ecological values. So it could be a really flexible system in terms of incorporating additional models. And again, I kind of showed an equal weighting. This is just sort of an equal weighting of the different variables, but the agency could also set you know, higher values or higher weights to some of these goals relative to others, or an individual producer. And then so kind of just to kind of conclude on some of this, at fine scales, what we can see is that, you know, in terms of restoring forest structure, these openings and trees and groups can be really important to a lot of different variables, but it can be really hard to actually implement these treatments. So I showed you a couple of successful examples from NRCS, but that's not always the case. There's lots of literature, not just from Colorado, but across the western U.S., that these kinds of treatments can be difficult because in a lot of cases it requires tree marking, which varies quite a bit from the traditional silviculture practices. So it involves tree marking to try to create these more complex patterns. And so there's some tools that are being developed, some GIS tools and phone apps that can help with, and LiDAR applications that can help with tree marking and planning these restoration treatments. And then at really large scale, simulation tools can help understand the trade-offs between different ecological objectives and help identify areas where you may want to prioritize investments in treatment. And I wanted to kind of close for a minute just to talk about our next steps. And in general, we were talking about ponderosa pine systems in western forests, but some of our newer efforts, partly because of my move from Colorado to closer to home in Georgia, is now turning to looking at how we can develop some restoration evaluations in longleaf pine in the southeastern U.S. So this is with some colleagues at the Jones Center at Ichauway, Stephen Brantley, Stephen Galladay, and Kevin McIntyre. And if you're not familiar with longleaf pine, it actually has a lot of similarities to ponderosa in some ways, and that historically it was quite open, herbaceous understory, frequent fire. Of course, frequent here is more like 1 to 3 years rather than 10 to 20 or 30. But we wanted to apply some similar frameworks to understanding where we may best implement restoration of longleaf pine. So, like I mentioned, longleaf pine is a conservation species of conservation concern for NRCS and others. It's down to about only 5% of its historic range across the southeast. A lot of it was logged or used for turpentine, and then it requires frequent input of prescribed fire, so fire suppression is also a factor in degradation of longleaf pine ecosystems. One interesting thing about longleaf pine, though, is because of its lower density and it usually has a C4 grass understory, water use tends to be lower in a ponderosa pine, or I'm sorry, a longleaf pine ecosystem compared to a mixed hardwood system or a planted pine, commercial pine like loblolly stand. So restoration of longleaf pine in some instances may actually increase water yield by lowering the amount of water that's removed from the below ground by the forest system. It leads more into the streams, and so there's been a study that's in progress here that was done at the Jones Center in Southwest Georgia that basically used SWOT to model how a restoration of longleaf pine compares to some of the current land uses. And so what we're wanting to do now is expand that analysis to several watersheds across the southeastern U.S. and evaluate sort of at an entire watershed scale, how may longleaf pine restoration increase water yields, and how may that contribute to decrease water yields at some critical times throughout the season. And so this is kind of a pilot study where we're looking at these 3 watersheds. Initially, these kind of span a gradient from east to west across the southeastern U.S., which also corresponds to some climate change projections for water availability. And so we want to ask some questions about, is this something that, can we use these kinds of tools to prioritize longleaf pine restoration? What's the appropriate scale to evaluate that? And can we develop some information for agencies like NRCS to potentially prioritize investments in things like easements or prioritize investments in longleaf restoration? And then I think I'll turn it back over to you, Lori, to pick up right here.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much. So those 2 forest projects are all about effective conservation solutions. In other words, making acres count. Restoration-based forest management in Colorado seeks a variety of important fire risk reduction and ecological outcomes. With a restoration approach, it's often true that the initial treatment costs are higher than with traditional fuel hazard designs. However, with that increased cost comes a greater net return on investment in a number of ways. Improved ecological function within the forest provides more resistance and resilience against threats such as pest and disease cycles, invasive species, and fire recurrence and behavior. Restoration designs also result in multiple objectives being met, including ecological benefits related to the wildlife habitat, grazing systems, forest health, a viable wood products industry, and landscape scale fire behavior change. Amassing data that can inform ecological site processes from historical data sites is also complementary to the development of ecological site descriptions. Where fuel reduction projects simply aim to mitigate fire behavior up to a threshold fire weather condition, forest restoration is focused on an inclusive whole forest and whole watershed function. So again, it's not just about counting acres that we apply conservation to. It's about making those acres count, getting results, stabilizing and improving the resources. There are several ways that NRCS can use this type of data. We're sharing the spatial layers from this study in Colorado with our Resource Assessment Branch GIS lab to explore opportunities to evaluate effective targeting of forest practices. We're expanding research efforts to additional forest types, such as the longleaf pine area, to determine more effective treatment designs. The development of ecological site descriptions and using our plot and site scale treatment data to map out watersheds with the greatest chance for success is essential. Colorado NRCS is actively sharing this restoration approach with non-private forest land partners, leveraging our technical and financial resources to treat even more acres. Our partnership with CFRI, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, will continue even as we embark on a new partnership with the Jones Center in Georgia to explore longleaf pine restoration effects. We would like to thank all of our partners, and now we can open up the webinar for questions, which I'll be moderating. And it looks like so far we have one question in the Q&A pod. And this is something that I think both Jeff and I can tackle. Jeff, I'll take a stab at it first, and then I'll turn it over to you for any other comments you want to make. So the question is, what is the time and cost of an analysis like this? And so with respect to cost, I'll hit the cost first. We have another future SEEP project, again in Colorado, the same sub-watersheds, where we're going to try and analyze the cost. So Jeff, if you have any insight on that, I don't right now, but Jeff, I can turn that piece over to you. And with regard to the time component of the question, how much time does it take for an analysis like this? Jeff also is the expert on that, but I can definitely say that the time to actually do the analysis was fairly efficient, maybe about 1.5 years, but the data that goes into running that analysis is what takes quite a bit of time to collect and to understand, and then to parse out your landscapes, where in this particular project we were leveraging other existing projects that CFRI had partners in, and there were something like 634 individual measurement plots throughout the forest watersheds. And so that's a lot of plot data, but it didn't cover every single acre or every single potential soil combination with aspect and climate zone and other variables. So we had to actually sit down and build a framework that we then used to assign that plot data to similar landscapes that lacked data so that we could stretch our analysis over the entire watershed area. So that contributed to a little bit more time. So mostly it's making sure that you have the data to begin the analysis in the first place. And one thing that actually can shorten the time is trying to get your data all in one database or data system. So for this project and for a future project, we have used the VGS data system to help us manage our data.
So Jeff, I'm going to turn that over to you. Again, the question was, what is the time and cost of an analysis like this?
Yeah, in terms of time, I suppose it was maybe a year and a half from when we had a really good plan of exactly how we wanted to proceed. But a lot of that was working out individual, kind of building some understandings of different models and linking them together in appropriate ways. But the kind of, to me, the exciting part about this model is in a lot of ways it's kind of a framework. So if we were to do this over again and use those different components of FLAM map or Russell, the fire and erosion component, it'll be relatively quick because a lot of the calibration and decisions are out there. So a lot of it was just trying to work through how can we best represent restoration treatments, what do they look like, how do we define desired conditions at the appropriate scale and things like that. So it's the kind of interesting part that would keep this from being kind of a pretty quick analysis is adding in new components. So I mentioned one of the things we're looking at is adding in bird community, and so these are all just coupled models. So they kind of depend on, they're modular and they depend on the different data sources and models that go into it. We could relatively easily incorporate this bird community data over the next year, but that kind of belies the fact that the partners that we're working with on that have been collecting that data for 3 or 4 years. So kind of like Lori said, there's the biggest effort is kind of getting the underlying assumptions sort of nailed down through different data and projects. So expanding this to a new area with very similar questions and very similar restoration would be really quick. To a new area that had really different outcomes or really different ecological objectives would be much more difficult.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Another question related to that is with limited financial resources, how can local watershed planning groups leverage information like this in their outreach and watershed planning efforts? And Jeff, I'll take this first and then I want you to chime in again as well. I really envision this work where local partnership groups can work with NRCS. NRCS reaches out and works with other partners as well, and we can all just come together and have a coordinated planning effort within a given watershed. And like Jeff had described, we can kind of turn those dials on the model, maybe weight the different objectives differently, and arrive at a solution for a particular watershed or a particular group of landowners within a watershed. And so I think that at least in this Colorado study and then hopefully in future studies in forest land areas, we will start to have some of this baseline analysis available. And so NRCS would be a place to go where you can actually start engaging with some of these data sets and start asking questions that would matter to your local area. Jeff, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I was going to mention in Colorado, we were working with some local planning groups and who were using some of this information. And in a lot of ways, the kind of, usually a lot of these groups have their own objectives and maybe constraints on who funders for projects are, what their goals are. So in that prioritization map that I showed at the end, I just kind of weighted everything equally, but if all of your funding is coming from, say, fire prevention or from water protection or wildlife, then those weights may change a bit. And so it'd just be a matter of kind of looking at those different maps and assessing where funds from different projects are going to have the biggest impact and how they fit into the larger goal. So, I would never argue that some kind of prioritization like this is a silver bullet to tell you exactly what treat and what order to treat in, but it can provide a lot of information for maps for local planning groups to kind of stand over and assess how that fits in with local opportunities, and that's going to depend a lot on the local land ownership and what constraints that they have. So anyways, I could see this kind of fitting into these different maps, fitting in as data inputs to the decision-making process when it comes to planning those larger restoration treatments. Another way is a lot of seeking funding for restoration and conservation projects, often asked to kind of demonstrate that your individual treatment is going to have a landscape impact, or it's going to have bring some benefits beyond your acres. And we've used some of this kind of data to show how a restoration treatment in a particular watershed, though it's small, it may be an important part of the puzzle in terms of restoring heterogeneity to an area. So anyways, I think in general, kind of the easiest thing would just be standing over some of these color-coded maps and seeing how it corresponds to the planning that's going on within them.
All right, and Jeff, we've got one more kind of combined question that I'll just turn over to you, and we're getting short on time. So this last combined question reads, shouldn't a patchy restoration treatment lead to more soil erosion? Did the simulated restoration treatment lead to desired soil erosion outcomes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we, in this study, we're not looking at like the immediate restoration or treatment-induced, disturbance-induced erosion. We were specifically looking at post-fire erosion, which you know, erosion of any kind can be an issue. But in this region, the really high inputs of sediment immediately in a couple of years immediately after wildfire is what was of the greatest concern. And from one of those early photos that I showed in the restoration treatments, there's pretty high understory response, especially in meadows after a year or two, and which has a big mitigating effect on some of the immediate sort of effects on mechanical treatment. What we were looking at was post-fire erosion, and so we ran these models, and you know, what would we see if we had a a fire under severe conditions, and what would the erosion impact from that be, and then compared that to the erosion impacts from an area that had been treated. And so we would look at the difference between those two. So it's kind of an avoided sediment specifically from the post-fire. I think your question would be interesting to explore too, the kind of are there any perhaps short-term impacts of the treatments themselves on erosion?
Right. Thank you for that, Jeff. And also just a note that, well, like you mentioned, the understory vegetation was filling back in, and this was a post-fire erosion assessment. As longer periods of time go by, then we're going to have that closure, that protection of the soil. So that's possibly something that we could look at also exploring down the road is under a historical or restored forest, are we achieving soil erosion target goals or saved soil goals versus in more of those uniform stands that may be untreated or then receive heavy fires or hard fires. So okay, with that, I guess we can close. Liz, did you have any ending comments?
Thank you. Thanks, Lori. I just want to thank Chief Lohr and you, Lori, and Dr. Jeff Cannon for taking time out of their schedules for today's presentation. And thanks to everyone who attended today's webinar. We hope to see you next month. Our webinar next month will be entitled Conservation Outcomes of NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife in Eastern Forests. Have a great afternoon, everyone.